Hi, everyone. Good evening, good evening, good evening. Welcome to our first session for Black History Month 2021. Woo, woo, woo! Talking back, talking black. Where did I get that topic from? I think it was the song in the 90s, Talking Back, Talking Black. Dope, right? So I'm excited about tonight. This is the first of four sessions. And so we are welcoming people into the room. But tonight I have some very dear friends with me, dear friends and colleagues, sojourners in the fight. Voices indeed. I work from various spheres of influence. I have with me tonight Dr. Kai Sadler of Rowan University. She is a psychologist in the Wellness Center there and a DEI coordinator for the Voices of Psychological and Mental Health Wellness. She is also a consultant and trainer for You Good Fam, which is fostering mental health advancement. And she'll explain it because I just butchered that, but she is a wonderful voice doing work around supporting wellness for students of color, not just students of color, but for individuals of color in various spheres of influence and how mental health and wellness impact that particular realm and region. And she'll share a little bit more about her expertise when we pivot to her. And then we have my friend and colleague, Dr. Jason Rivera, who is the Vice Chancellor for Academic Success at Rutgers Camden. And he does tons of work within the community and around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has been a wonderful voice for me for spitballing some challenging experiences. And so I appreciate him. Certainly an authentic voice, and I would say a prophetic voice. And what that means to me is a voice that does not mind being a trailblazer to the truth, offering authentic sound to things that people don't always want to say. But he is often willing to put his voice to power in those spaces. And I appreciate both of you for being here. And so tonight we are talking about anti Black racism. What does anti Black racism mean? So we've heard the term racism, but not particularly anti Black when it comes to the structures of anti Black racism. So, first, anti Black racism has a historical and structural concern within, particularly because we are in a university setting and these here voices are university sounds. Universities have been historically a part of the colonial structures that have historically excluded Black voices. And so, in understanding this, the manifestations of excluding Black voices have looked like silencing and silence at the table or minimizing Black culture, Black thought, Black experiences, and not just in a monolithic tone of African American people, but the term Black as it pervades across all margins and intersectionality. Um, Having the experiences of making those who are Black or have Black sound feel as though what they have to say or what they have to offer is not important, or if it is not it as important, it is less significant than those at the table. And so when we see this, we must be able to examine what this looks like within the critical frames of how we personally show up, how we support the organizations we're a part of, and what this looks like within the systems that we belong to. And I think in having these conversations, universities and organizations need to critically reflect upon the experiences and the authentic sound of those of us who are or hold Black voices, and how to be inclusive of Black voices within the space. So we have some questions tonight that we have some preemptive questions, but I do believe that the conversation is going to be less than stiff tonight, because all of us have experiences professionally, personally, and in terms of our own life's journey that we can lend to this. And I don't mind being a sacrificial lamb because I believe that it is in us showing our wounds that we are able to heal others. I do believe in the power of the narrative And I do believe that the narrative unlocks some things that helps us to connect to compassion. I don't always feel like we know what people are experiencing until they give voice to that. And so tonight, if you are here and listening, I thank you for being present. I do want to acknowledge some folk in the room. Dr. Naima Watson, who is now our Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion writ large. Congratulations to you. She is a Black woman and has been doing this work for quite some time. And I want to thank you for being here. Some friends of mine who are, I would say, accomplices and allies who are not quite Black voices, but you stand up for me at the table. Thank you so much. And to all of the colleagues who I may or may not know that you are here because I cannot see you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And so I'm going to pivot to our first question. And our first question is, wait, before I ask the first question, I am so sorry. I want to give these voices some time to introduce themselves personally because I may have botched your titles and all of the things that you do. So take 2 minutes and explain to the people who you are, and then we'll pivot to the question.
Go ahead, Kai.
Okay, first, thank you so much, Ms. Neal, for inviting me tonight. Truly, it's an honor and a privilege anytime that I'm able to serve in any capacity, not just only in the therapeutic room, but more certainly in terms of outreach outside of the four walls. So as Ms. Neal has already shared, my name is Dr. Kai Sadler. I am one of the mental health clinicians at Rowan University within our Wellness Center, and I'm also the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator. Also, I am the owner and founder of You Good Fam, which stands for Fostering and Advancing Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing for Students of Color. So again, thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Good evening, and let me echo the appreciation for the invitation to be a part of this panel tonight. Jason Rivera, I am the Vice Chancellor for Student Academic Success at Rutgers University, Camden. Very excited about the work we're doing there around student success. Part of that work involves looking at student outcomes, and we're beginning now to look at equitable student outcomes and beginning to work toward developing an equity mindset. I'm excited about the work that Dr. Watson has been charged with doing because I think it's going to help to move our campus forward in the equity conversation, which is really, really important when we start to talk about how universities, and we were having a conversation prior to this about sort of the structure of universities and the origins of universities and whether or not they were spaces that were created for people like us. And by people like us, I mean Black and brown folk. And I think the work that we're going to be doing under Naima's leadership and others on our campus will help us to begin to create spaces and places where students of color can thrive and actually be successful. I always remind folks that because these institutions were not built for our success, I can never truly say that these spaces will ever be safe, but we can create braver and safer spaces as we continue to unpack and do the work that's necessary to create more equity-minded approaches to the way we go about supporting students. So I look forward to our conversation tonight. I'm excited about this conversation, but also the work that lies ahead as we continue to figure out how we create a more just and equitable world for all of us.
Awesome. Thank you both for your contributions to the academic space and what you do outside of it. Your voices are needed and appreciated. Make sure you're mentoring someone to do just what you do so that the transition and passing of the baton does not fall to the ground and the work that you are doing continues. I love you both. All right, so let's dig into these questions. The first question is, I've heard it said that anti-Black racism is really just this made up thing, or if it is an attempt to create an ethnocentric or a divisive way of looking at racial identity. Can you speak a little bit to that?
That's a lie. It's a lie. Let me see. What can I say about that? Well, I guess first what we have to do is we'd have to unpack what it means to be anti-Black, right? And that is sort of the erasure of Blackness, the erasure of the experiences of Black people. It is an erasure of the systemic oppression that continues to pervade in our culture. And if you ascribe to the belief that those things don't exist, then I can see how you might ascribe to the belief that anti-Blackness is something that's just been made up or created. But if you truly believe that we live in a society where there are folks who are privileged, where there are sort of these systems of hierarchy and these sort of racist structures, then there's no way you can believe that anti-Blackness doesn't exist. And I want to be clear here when we're talking about anti-Blackness that we're thoughtful about the way we think about Blackness itself, right? Because Blackness is not just about African or African American identified peoples. And so when we talk about anti-Blackness, we're talking about a spectrum of folks that needs to be a part of the conversation. And I'll say, you know, clearly for the purposes of this conversation, I identify as a Black Latino, as a Black Latinx male, right? And so it's important for folks to understand that Blackness is not about the hue or shade or the color of your skin. It's, you know, there's a whole host of things that go into identifying what it means to be Black.
Powerful. Dr. Kai, anything to add there about the ethnocentric perception or the divisive nature by which it is anti-Blackness is perceived?
Mhm. Well, first, I think it's important to highlight that it is real. It's not a figment of our imagination in terms of if anti-Black racism even exists. I believe that most certainly it's not only a construct, but most certainly a lived experience that Blacks have encountered for centuries. And prior to, you know, us meeting on this platform, our conversation prior to, and you even alluded to it at the very beginning, just there being this historical context, that it's something that we as a people have faced through consistent systemic racism for centuries. So I definitely believe that anti-Black racism, from my perspective, is anything or anyone that really opposes or there's opposition towards whether the individual self-identifies as a Black person, or it can be policies, it could be procedures, it could be practices and laws, quite frankly, that are rooted in systems. So whether, as we've been talking about, whether the systems is the healthcare system, the school system, so the judicial system, all of the systems that, again, are in place to hinder and minimize not only the contributions, but also interfere with the advancement of Blacks.
I think that, and that's very powerful. I think in reflecting on your statement, I'm reminded that we cannot, and I'm going to say this, we cannot have conversations around anti-Black racism without talking about the ideology of white supremacy. Right. It is the elevation of one idea or one ideology at the denigration of another. Right. And so if we lift one idea, we have to denigrate the other. And I think when you look at that as a dichotomy and always this tug of war between the two, and the challenge in observing how these things kind of clash in spaces, it'll lend to us looking at, and I know I'm getting a little head, but it'll lend to us looking at the idea of anti-Black racism outside of the lens of ethnocentrism. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more because I know I said a mouthful. It is my observation that when we attempt to be inclusive around particular marginalized voices in a room, those perceived having the dominant voice, those of privilege, often look at elevating those who are minimized as being an ethnocentric sound, or a sound of leaning more to elevating a group of people as opposed to leveling the playing field, right? And so and having these conversations with people of various different racial identities, I have heard it said that if I allow the Black person in the room to have more of a voice than they have, it will look like we are elevating Black voices over white voices, right? And I think even with that idea, we need to begin to talk about where that idea comes from, right? And it comes from this larger notion of white supremacy, in that the structure of whiteness holds that white voices always need to be the dominant voice or take over the space. And I know that that's a hard pill to swallow, but we can't have conversations around anti blackness without elevating that sound. What do you guys think about that?
I think that's pretty powerful. But I want to go back to something first, because I don't want to lose this point. The idea of folks thinking that anti-blackness is made up is anti-black in and of itself. Right? And I don't want us to forget that, right? This idea that this is some made up thing, this is phony, this doesn't exist, is in and of itself a problematic framework, right? And so I didn't get to say that in my previous comments. I wanted to make sure I named that into this discussion. Now, based on what you just described and what you just said about whiteness, I think it's a slippery slope, right? And I think it's a challenge, because it's hard for people to wrap their head around whiteness as a frame, right? Especially when you're talking with white people about whiteness, because oftentimes white people feel like when you talk about whiteness, you're talking about me. When whiteness is pervasive and it's not specific to white people.
Right.
And sometimes we don't have enough conversation about the way whiteness seeps into communities of color, into our mindsets, into our behaviors, into our practices, and how we ourselves can be anti-black, and how we can perpetuate anti-blackness and create marginalization and oppression within our own communities. And so that when I say it's a slippery slope, I think the problem is we're not having direct, honest conversations about these things, but we're also not coming up as a community with collective language, with shared language about how to talk about these things. So when we say whiteness, some people will hear one thing, other people will hear another thing, and we're talking across each other. And I think that's part of the problem. I don't know if that gets at what you were just discussing, but I think
it absolutely does. Yeah, and I think for the purpose of this conversation, let's name that here, right? Because the intent of this conversation is for us to be able to uncover, right? And so when we discuss whiteness, I would say in my learning that structures of whiteness really hold to the idea of privilege and a certain identity being elevated over the other, which again, as you mentioned, has seeped into our subconscious and even our conscious spaces, right? And we can talk a little bit later about what that actually looks like, but it's this idea that we are policed, and we are policing ourselves based on a thought that one particular dominant culture holds over the entire culture.
Reified through every structure and system and process that we're exposed to, right? So if you think about what you're exposed to when you're in school, it's that whiteness sort of framing. When you think about what you're exposed to in financial institutions, it's a framing of whiteness. When you think about what you're exposed to in the church, what you're exposed to in the medical field, it's all being reified. So it's constantly being reinforced in your experience. It's not explicit, and that's the problem, because it's not explicit. It's not something that we can actually just put our finger on and say, oh, that's where it exists. That's why it becomes so hard for us to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think the other part of that, and I see you, Dr. Kai, she tried to jump in there. I think too, it's important for us to name that when we're talking about it, it's not with the intent to offend anybody that, listen, you guys don't know this, but I am multiracial. And okay, so I'm not accusing, but I think it's important for us to uncover all of the things within our own space of things, in our own identity, in our own acculturation process. And in doing so, we're not accusing those who are in human relationship. We are attempting to level the playing field. So I hope that it doesn't come across as othering, but more so an observation for us to deconstruct and analyze the pieces that create systematic injustice, so that we can create equitable and inclusive environments within our systems, and so that we can stop injuring ourselves and each other with some of these frameworks. Go ahead, Dr. Kai.
Sure. No, so to your point, as far as white supremacy, white privilege, I don't believe that we could continue this conversation and not address the elephant in the room, because we most certainly wouldn't want there to be a monkey on anyone's back. So in that, It's important for us to look at anti-Black racism, again, even from a historical context, because as we've already, made mention and we're well aware in terms of the consistent systemic racism. So even back, as many of us, are well aware, back in the 1800s, 1900s, in terms of the Jim Crow laws and segregation, that we are well aware that at that particular time, it was meant specifically to oppress Blacks and to elevate whites. So it was already ingrained again into the system to amplify anti-Blackness. And I may be jumping ahead, yet I'm going to share this thought as well, that I begin to think about all of the horrific killings among our, Black men through police brutality, as well as women. And it's almost kind of like psychologically a form of lynching, where there's this reenactment of what occurred years ago, still playing out in a different form. So again, when we talk about white privilege and white supremacy and being part of a Eurocentric dominant culture, we cannot address anti-Black racism without, again, speaking to the the origin or the ideology in terms of how we've gotten to this point.
You made me think about a lot of the conversation I had prior to our former president being able to uncover, all of the ugliness that was sort of laying dormant in our country, right? And that's this idea that we were living in this post-racial society. And we got a Black president, and we made progress, and we've arrived, and we've gotten to this place, when in fact that wasn't the case. And events of the last 4 years, and even as recent as what happened in the Capitol on January 6th, demonstrate to us that we are far from any place that we thought we might have arrived because we had a Black president. And in fact, it's only gotten worse as a result. And it just makes me think about, especially how you just framed it in terms of the historical context, how we've been down this road before. We've seen this happen before. We've experienced all of these things before. The times have changed. And so the way that it manifests is different. The way that we have access to it is different. But we're still living through the same traumas. And we're re-traumatizing generations with these, experiences. And if we really want to talk about how we get to a place where we can begin to unpack some of these things, we have to wrestle with, these conversations, and we have to start creating spaces and places for people to have conversations about how to unpack this now, so that it's not something that they live with for generations and generations. We have to do better.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. J, because it's, I'm of the mindset that we most certainly can repeat what we don't repair. So this, aspect of historical or generational trauma, it is, as we are well aware, it becomes a continuum, and it continues. And I believe that with us having opportunities such as now, and just even institutions recognizing the necessity of infusing DEI work even more intentionally in policies and pedagogy in every aspect of the institution, that we most certainly can hopefully move to a place of not hurting individuals, but being a facilitator in their healing.
I think that's so powerful. I mean, we're at a tipping point, right? We're clearly in a space of racial reckoning. And I think for our community, for our campus, for our university rather, right? Having Jonathan Holloway as our current president, I think is really, really going to be transformative for Rutgers University, right? And his goal of building a beloved community, and the work that's happening under Dr. Branch, Dr. Watson, the things that are coming, that are on the horizon for our campus and our community, the conversations that are about to unfold. I think there's a lot of possibility and a lot of promise for us to be able to start doing some of the unpacking that we're talking about, and to start sort of looking at some of the, not only the current trauma, but the historical trauma that we've had to live through. what we need to be doing is figuring out how we create within our communities the capacity to have those conversations and the ability to not only have the conversations, but to move on from those conversations in a way that leads to action.
I wanna pivot to asking one of the questions because something Dr. Kai said triggered it. But Dr. J, you said something about trauma, right? And we talk a lot about racial trauma, but we don't necessarily name what racial trauma looks like, right? And I think all of us can offer ourselves as case studies and sacrificial lambs in this space. But how do you, because you mentioned the racial reckoning, how do you begin to address racial trauma while still holding a armor against the hostility around conversations when it comes to the racial injustices and racial issues within institutions, right? Because you know it's this idea of I am constantly your punching bag, traumatized by your unconscious and subconscious assaults towards me. But at the same time, when I attempt to share my experiences, there's a level of hostility that I don't deserve to discuss what it is that has been done, not just against me, and even saying against me, it is said that, oh, you're taking it personally. But then when I frame it to this is a systemic issue, then it turns into a conversation of another kind. So how do you begin to discuss authentically the trauma that comes as a result of being a warrior, but at the same time dealing with the hostility and having the conversation around what needs to be had to address this issue?
That is a powerful question, and it might be too soon for me, for me to provide an answer.
The wounds of war, the wounds of war.
Are very, very fresh. I think what I would say is we are a resilient people, right? And trauma is embedded in our DNA. And so in addition to the trauma being embedded in our DNA, so too is the resilience that's needed to overcome the trauma. And part of our work needs to be confronting these things as they arise and building the capacity to have the confrontational discussions as they arise, without necessarily having to be adversarial or confrontational, right? And so when I say addressing the confrontation, I'm not saying we have to fight about these things, right? But we need to be naming into the spaces that we occupy that these things exist. We need to figure out the language and tools that are necessary to do that. But we also need to develop a community of care that we can retreat to, so that we can heal, we can, recharge, we can make sure that we're not sort of in our own heads and that these experiences are not sort of these singular experiences. And that is, part of the difficulty around this work. It is very, very challenging, I think, very, very challenging to go day after day living as a Black or brown person in the skin that we have and have these traumatic experiences, and then to invite those things to be a part of our professional experiences, and still be able to do this without any sort of trauma or any support. I have to say that is one of the reasons why I made a very conscious decision as I was thinking about my career trajectory and my pathway, not to be a chief diversity officer. It was a very intentional decision, because I knew that I didn't have the strength that I would have needed at the time to be able to do that work and still be a whole individual, right? And that's part of the work. When you talk about how it is that we can engage in this type of work, you have to know, yourself. You have to know what your capacity is, right? And part of that is actually going through the fire and figuring out, I didn't break. I might have bent. I didn't break, but if I go through that again, I might break. So I need to take a step back.
Right.
So I think part of it is just doing the reflective work, like being very honest with yourself about what it is you can and cannot handle. And I'll tell you, there's been times, even very recently, I've had experiences where I still retreat and feel really, really wounded. Sometimes I want to cry about some of the experiences that I've had, but I still come back every day recharged and ready to fight the good fight, because I occupy a space that many people who look like me don't occupy. And if my voice is not at the table asking the questions, they don't get asked. And that means we're not looking at the things that we need to be looking at, so that we can create these more just and equitable spaces, right? And that's a heavy thing to bear. And I don't think of myself as anybody's martyr. in any way, right? I think there are lots of us who are doing this work across, many, many different fields and many different industries. But we don't spend enough time commiserating and sharing those experiences with one another so that we can then learn from one another about how it is we've been able to overcome them. And that's, I think, where the work needs to exist for, this ongoing sort of fight.
Yeah, yeah, so good, so good. Dr. Kai, you have any thoughts on that? The concept about hostility and trauma. So how do you address the trauma within while addressing the hostility without?
So I think that's a very powerful question. So whether it's in the context of trauma, whether it's in the context of a mood disorder or any other DSM-5 diagnosis,
Mhm.
it's important to recognize the symptomology
Mhm.
because it's very easy when we have been conditioned. This is the work that we, at least some may feel as though that they've been called to do and may not even realize that what one is experiencing is race-based stress or race-based trauma. So I think the first step is being able to recognize what's going on. And when you're able to name it, then you're able to tame it. So when you're not aware again of what's going on emotionally and cognitively, it can become a little difficult where if you're having that internal dialogue or maybe even with someone else, like, why am I feeling this way when I go into this space? Why am I noticing that I'm having this, arousal where all of a sudden my heart is beating very rapidly in this
Yes.
space, but I don't feel this way when I'm elsewhere? Why
Mhm.
is it that I'm noticing when I'm around, specific colleagues that I'm finding myself again just feeling I'm the sense of doubt or a sense of mistrust that I usually don't have in my interpersonal relationships.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's important to recognize um, the symptoms that are associated with race-based trauma, such as intrusive thoughts, or again, as I may mention, the physiological arousal that we may find ourselves
Mhm.
experiencing, and just even um, having what's referred to as kind of like this altered, cognition of um, not just Black people, yet it could be the experience of anyone of who identifies as a person of color, that I don't trust people or I don't trust white people. So again, I think when we hear terms and statements such as that, it bears for us to have a better understanding of the symptoms and what may actually be going on for us as professionals in this work.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think for me, it was the imposter syndrome and the hypervigilance. This need to over create, right? To prove myself, right? Because I didn't feel like I was seen or validated. So yeah, so it was this desire to show those that I was around that I was as smart as you know or smarter than or whatever.
Mhm.
So yeah, I definitely get that piece. And I think going back to what Dr. J said, having a tribe or folk that you could kind of process that with, and to ask them to observe you in space. What did I look like in this space? Because this is what I felt. And so, let me work on how to address this
Mhm.
particular thing. What are some other evidences, and even to pivot to you all, what are some evidences for you that you've experienced in some ways racial trauma?
Ooh. See, before we go there, I just want to add something to the previous comment because I think it's important.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, one is that we need to also remember our allies and
Hmm.
those people who can actually support us as we're engaging in the work. But the other
Yes.
part of it is, and this was a very hard lesson for me to learn. Every fight is not my fight. I
Right.
don't have to take on every single thing,
Hmm.
and that I think is a very difficult thing to do when you are so used to being the one of one. Because if you don't answer or you don't respond or you don't ask the question, the fear is that it's just not going to get asked or it's not going to get answered, right? And so when I talk about leveraging your allies, part of it is you don't have to ask all of the questions. You can actually plant the seeds for those questions to be asked by people who can support you by asking the question, right? And so there's ways, I think, to strategize how to do the work so that it's not as impactful upon you in an adverse way. And that just requires more thought, more strategy, and such. But again, there's ways to do that.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I didn't want to lose that piece before we.
Yeah, no, that's a very powerful point. I think I probably wouldn't have been here as long if it were not for my allies, and the individuals that I trust in terms of that aren't brown, black or brown voices, but that I know have my best interest in space. And I'm just we can't do that work. Reconciliation work does not happen without our accomplices and our allies. And so that's important. Thank you for naming that. We have a few minutes left and I want to get to some other points, but can you give examples of your own experiences with anti-Black racism? It could either be professionally or personally, and how you were able to navigate that experience.
My goodness, there are a lot of stories, but you just highlighted we have only a few moments. So I will just share one that comes to mind that I think ties very nicely into this conversation. So I was in my doctoral program, and during my doctoral training, I was at a particular site. And while I was at this site, I was completing a psychological evaluation. And I used the term passed away to highlight the client who had experienced death of some sort. So I didn't use the language died or killed or death. I used the term passed away. So during supervision, my supervisor at the time was a white male. And during supervision, he said to me, Kai, is that a term that African Americans use? And I was floored. I was totally astonished. And I said to him, wow, I did not know that I needed to. No, I said, I guess I need to do some more research on my own culture. Because I had just was totally baffled because I never heard of that. So going back to what we were talking about before in terms of this racial trauma, probably maybe a couple months later, still at the same training site, I was brought into a meeting with an individual, wasn't my supervisor, and said, Kai, I was asked to speak to you about your eyes. So I'm sitting on the edge of my seat, very inquisitive to understand what the purpose of this question, was. And that's all that was said. I'm here to talk to you about your eyes. And I knew that there was this message that was being implied that I may have been intoxicated because I was very tired during this time when I was satisfying my requirements. And it most certainly put me in a place in that setting where I found myself being very cognizant of my words, rehearsing the terms I would use, because I really felt as though, and I was being judged in a way that I never experienced ever. So that I'll leave it there. It was definitely a trying time, and yet having gone through it for the sake of students, I would do it again, because out of that birth, you good fam. Because I want to make sure that I ask any and all students, you good. So what was most certainly trying became a triumph for me.
Talk about resilience. How about that?
It's so funny. A couple of days ago, I posted a message on Facebook about how it's been over 5 years and I'm still unpacking the trauma associated with my doctoral journey. and and you just triggered a memory for me as I was sitting here, because I was racking my brain about what it is I can actually share, because there's not so many of my experiences with anti-Blackness happen in professional settings, and I don't want to put myself in a position where I have to then go back and explain things to some folks. So I was sitting here trying to think about what is it that I can share that's actually acceptable for me to share. And you triggered a memory from my doctoral experience that I'm going to share now. I had just been readmitted back into my doctoral program. I went to the University of Maryland, College Park for my PhD. And I started there while I was working there. And there was a mix-up. My supervisor told me when I left there in November, and I was in my course, doing coursework at that time. And I had a conversation with my supervisor and said, if I leave now, would I lose my tuition remission? To which she said, no, you've been here for more than 50% of the semester. You'll be good. I left, went to work at a different institution. And when the semester ended, I got a $12,000 bill for the tuition. And so I reached out to the supervisor, who ghosted me, literally didn't want to respond because she knew she screwed up. We figured it out eventually, but because of all of this, I had to take a semester off. And so I took a semester off, and this was my first semester back. And I had come into the semester, we'd worked everything out, and my cohort was actually taking a class that I had not registered for yet because it was closed. And I had registered for stats all on my own, and stats is not something I'm very comfortable with. So I was having a conversation with my advisor. Our cohort was small, we were all very tight, and they said, Jason, you should actually just register for this class. We're all in this class together, we're gonna work it through together, we'll be fine. And so we went online and we looked, and it just so happened that somebody dropped the class and there was one seat open in the class that had before been closed. I registered for the class, dropped the stats class, went ahead and emailed the professor because the semester had already begun, but it was still during the ad drop period. Emailed the professor and said, I'm very excited to be a part of your class. I know you've already got things started. I'm friends with many students in the class. They've given me the readings to catch up on. I know there's an assignment that's due next class. I'll be working on the assignment. Please email me any additional information I might need. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to have a conversation. Sent the email off. This was, let's say, on a Wednesday. The class was on a Tuesday. The next class was on a Tuesday. This was on a Wednesday. Never heard back from the professor until the Monday before the day of class. And when I heard back from her, basically what she said was, you cannot add this class to your schedule. This class is full. And so I responded back to her and said, with all due respect, the class wasn't full because I didn't get any special permission to register for it. I'm now in the class. She didn't respond to me. She sent my communication to the chair and had the chair respond to me. And this is where things got hairy. So the chair calls me up and calls my advisor up. And she asked my advisor to give me an independent study instead of having me take this class. So my advisor calls me and she says, well, the chair wants you to take an independent study with me. The independent study isn't going to do what this class will do for you because this is a requirement. You'll eventually have to take it. So it's really your call. You register for the class, you did everything you were supposed to do. If you want to stay in the class, we can go meet with the chair and have a conversation with her. So I said, I'd rather stay in the class. Let's go talk to the chair. We scheduled some time that same afternoon because the next day was class. So that same afternoon, we went and scheduled time to talk to the chair. I show up in the chair's office and she's a wonderful woman. I met her before, never had her for class before, but met her before. And so she explained to me why I'm not going to be joining this class. The class is over-registered. Even though somebody dropped it, they didn't close it in time before I registered for it, but they had intended to, and goes on this whole thing. So I stand my ground. I said, well, that's not my responsibility. It's not my fault that you all screwed up. I'm in the class and I want to stay in the class. I need this to graduate. So I want to stay in the class. So she leaves me and my advisor where we are and she goes off and talks to the professor. And then she comes back to me and she says, okay, we're going to allow you to stay in the class this time. But I expect that when this class is over, you're going to do well. You're going to work very hard. You're going to do well. And you're going to get the highest grade possible. And so I looked at her and I said, with all due respect, I have a 4.0 GPA. I have never had any issues with getting the grades that I need to get. And I'm curious about why it is you've chosen to have that conversation with me like you're doing me a favor to keep me in this class. Right? And so many people don't tie that to anti-Blackness. This was a white woman talking to me and telling me already that she expected that I wasn't going to give this 100%. I wasn't going to do well in this class. And this was going to be a problem for me. And she expected that giving me this talk would get me where I needed to be to make sure I perform well in this class. We got past it. I took the class, got an A in the class. Everything was fine. Eventually had that professor, that chair was eventually a professor of mine for another class. And she came back to me, this was years later, 2 or 3 years later during coursework, and said to me, I'm very sorry about that experience. I've reflected on that a lot since we had that conversation. And I didn't recognize then what I recognize now. And you're absolutely right. I apologize. And it was fine. But again, that is just one of many experiences that lead to that trauma, that ongoing trauma that you experience in these environments that are not crafted or created for your success. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I agree with you. And the whole grad school trauma, even with the racial colonization, I am going through that experience right now. So the PhD life is not for the faint of heart, and definitely challenging for those who are of marginalized identity. We have about 7 more minutes, and I do want to just ask this last question. How can persons who have anti-Black racial trauma begin to, one, and I'm going to pivot this to Dr. Kai, if a person has anti-Black racial trauma, how can they address these concerns? And then to you, Dr. J, how can organizations begin to address the concerns around anti-Black racial issues? So Dr. J, organizations, and Dr. Kai, kind of personal experiences of addressing anti-Black racial trauma.
Dr. Kai, you can go first.
So as I made mention earlier, I think can you hear me? Okay. The first step is recognizing and being aware of symptoms. So really just having to educate oneself because the fact that we've been exposed and minority stress, most certainly there's a lot of research that speaks to the psychological, the physiological impact that it has. So again, really educating ourselves about what race-based trauma, what race-based stress looks like, because of it being a byproduct of what we've been talking about in terms of many discriminatory acts that we've experienced. I think in conjunction, being able to process these experiences, our emotions, our thoughts with a therapist, even if it's within a religious community. Don't want to get too much in terms of research, yet I think is important no matter what the individual's religious identity, keep it in mind that it's important to pray and process. Sometimes if we were to look at that dialectically, it's easy for us just to remain on the one continuum in terms of just pray about it or just use only spiritual practices and tools. And that is advantageous. And there's another component that most certainly can be beneficial. As Dr. J made mention earlier in terms of allyship and joining affinity groups that will allow you to engage in racially conscious conversations to help facilitate and promote one's own healing. As you were even posing this question, Ms. Neal, I was also even thinking about creating or developing your own like trigger list or avoidant list, and that being a way in which you're able to begin to regulate your emotions, knowing again what surfaces when you're interacting with certain people, or if you're going into particular departments that activate these symptoms of trauma. And as I've shared, or at least I think I've shared, that it's important for us to face it, that we can't conquer what we don't confront. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Even the gaslighting aspect for me is avoiding folk who gaslight when I say that was a racial experience and they say, oh, no, it wasn't. Okay, I don't need to talk to you anymore. I'm going to pivot to somebody else. So thank you for that. Dr. J, you run the organization.
I think the organization question is complex because different types of organizations have different structures and different, things in place. What I will say is that I think you have to start by asking questions, right? And part of those questions are, who's at the table, who's not at the table, what is going on, why is it going on? If some body, group, individual, collective is absent, why are they absent? Have they been invited to the table? I think those are the types of questions you have to start asking yourself. The issue really is, where do you go with that, right? And so I think many organizations have a commitment in some way, especially today in today's time, to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They may not necessarily do a lot with it, and a commitment in and of itself does not necessarily mean they're doing the work. But if a group exists that is charged with doing this work, then beginning to engage with that group, participating, volunteering to be a part of those discussions, I think is the place to start. I think there are some organizations that are doing really transformative work, and it's really easy to get involved in that type of work because of it. But if you find, and this I think is the bigger question for me, not just how do I change the organization, but how do I change myself so I can change the organization? How do I get the skills that are necessary to change the organization? As part of that question for me. And I would say that there are a lot of different organizations that are out there, community-based organizations, nonprofits, that are engaged, steeped in this work, that are willing to train people who are, willing to engage in the work. And that those types of opportunities are really transformative because they provide you with skills that are transferable both to your personal and your professional life. And you can take those things and begin to do things in your professional spaces that are transformative. But you have to start by asking yourself, what are you willing to take on?
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example really quickly. I know we're getting ready to close. In the midst of everything that's been going on with Black Lives Matter and this, all the stuff related to the racial reckoning, in my own community, on the Next Door Neighbor app, there were a series of very problematic and aggressive conversations that began to emerge. And they were all being posed under the guise of not having political conversation. Right. So there were some really hateful things that were being said to tell people that this is not a platform to have political conversation. And the idea that Black lives conversations are political conversations. And I got involved in those conversations to the, against the advice of my husband, I got involved in those conversations. And basically argued that we can't talk about lives being political. Everything we do is political, right? But we can't talk about Black lives as a politic until we acknowledge that Black lives do matter, right? And then we can start talking about what that all means. And we can, in our respective communities, begin to grapple with, what that looks like. As a result of that conversation, as a result of going back and forth with a number of different people who were not necessarily like-minded, a group of people decided to come together and create what we're calling South Jersey Social Justice Group, right? But it was because we stood out and asked the questions and pushed back against those things that we all recognized that we were like-minded. And then we came together and said, okay, what can we be doing, around this work to begin to move the needle? And I'll tell you that the people who were engaging in the conversations, who wanted to do this work, are not DEI experts. They don't know everything that's related to DEI, right? They're just well-intentioned people who want to figure out how to actually help transform their communities. They may have their own issues and biases as well, but they're willing to actually take a look internally at what they need to be doing. Right. And so when I say start asking the questions, that's really what I'm talking about. Start interrogating your own thoughts, your own beliefs, your own, feelings, and begin to figure out where they resonate and where they're coming from. And then look for, opportunities to really unpack those and have conversation. You'll start to change yourself, but then you'll also begin to change communities and organizations that you're a part of as a result of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, in honor of Black History Month, I would give this analogy: what's in your kitchen? Before you can start cooking, right? You got to know what recipes and ingredients and all of that you have in your cabinet. And I think all of us have a level of genius and a superpower, something that we are all really good at. And it requires us to take an assessment of where our vantage point and where our necessary sphere of influence will be, right? And all of us is going to be different. But if we all approach it together from the vantage point that we have, we will get more done. And I will say, and I want to give an homage to the work that Canada, particularly Toronto, is doing around anti-Black racism. And the elevation of the conversation, every sphere of influence is now beginning to address anti-Black racism. You see the housing market, the academic market, the corporate sphere, journalism and media in various places are looking at how does anti-Black racism show up. And so when we begin to have these conversations at various places all at once, it's almost like a heavy hit at one, and it's not just a couple of small dents, but you're making a large impact around such a pervasive issue, so that that issue no longer grows, and that there's no ignorance to it. So I want to say thank you so very much for being my friends and my colleagues in this space. I really appreciate you, and I honor all that you have done and will do. I pray your strength in this work because the fight ain't easy. But journey on, my friends. And not next month, next week, we are going to be talking about Black royals in Bridgerton. So if you're interested, join us next week around Black royals in Bridgerton in the conversation on Talking Back, Talking Black. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week.